Hello, welcome to the Everything is Black and White podcast, live on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and later on our podcast channel. I'm Andrew Musgrove and I'm joined by Mark Douglas. We will discuss tonight's game against Burnley in the League Cup at the end of the show. So if you're listening later on the podcast and you get that point and you're listening after the game, you can then switch off. So we thought we'd give you that little heads up just there. We're going to start, Mark, with Steve Bruce and what he said in his press conference yesterday about transfers. He was asked, is anything imminent? What's going to be happening? And he pretty much just said, anything permanent, it's very unlikely. I think these words were, it's probably not going to happen. Now, not really a big shock. We've been reporting, that it's likely to be loans. But at the same time, I do worry. I look at that Newcastle United squad and I do question whether they've got enough to make it a comfortable season. I'm not necessarily saying they're going to go down and they're going to be in the, right in the mix of it, but I don't think it's going to be too comfortable. And I really do think, there is a need for at least another permanent signing. But of course, the finances at the club make that a bit difficult.
Well, the problem is part of the problem, I think, is the lack of sort of communication really from the club as to the reality of the finances. Look, I know, that they weren't going to come out and start the summer and suggest exactly where, exactly how much money they had. And as we saw from Joe Willock, the way that the club works, they don't really have a budget. It's more on a case-by-case basis. I think what's frustrating is that we've seen it, I think at the start of the window, the club, with the contracts they gave out to Dwight Gale, and a few of the others as well, Fabian Schär obviously getting a new contract and Jacob Murphy getting a long-term contract as well. It was pretty clear that what they were going to do this summer was pretty much protect what they had, stick with it, and then look to maybe add one or two loans. I think I felt it would be at that point in the summer. The difference is that what they could have done, and maybe if there hadn't have been the distraction of the takeover, and they'd have had other people in the club who maybe it was their role to possibly look 2, 3, 4, 5 transfer windows down the line, there would have been ways in which they could have changed things. Gone out and got some free transfers, or went and twisted a little bit on what they had. What they've decided to do is pretty much go with what they had. It's I wrote about it yesterday. It's a safety first strategy, and it was always going to mean that there was only going to be possibly one signing. I think kudos to Steve Bruce for managing to persuade Mike Ashley to go out and sign Joe Willock. It shouldn't come to that for a club of the size of Newcastle, but unfortunately that's where we are. Part of that's the pandemic. Part of it is, as I said, because they've re-signed all the players who are out of contract. If you looked at it when Rafa Benitez left, or just before he left, you could have looked at 2021 as maybe the summer when things really could have changed at Newcastle. They could have taken a few risks. I mean, it wouldn't have necessarily worked to get rid of the likes of Gale, the likes of Jacob Murphy, people that we know, are solid. 6 out of 10 possibly. They may make a difference in the course of the season. Decent squad players possibly, but that was the approach that the club had. I think there's been an awful lot of distraction of the takeover. That has stopped, I think, the club planning forward, and I think that's what we've ended up with this summer. When it was clear that the takeover wasn't going to happen this summer, and in fact, that's right on the back burner, we were left with a situation where they had to make some snap decisions, if you will. So we end up where we are. For me, if the Joe Willock situation, they've obviously either taken out a bit more of an overdraft, or they've found some money from somewhere, or there could have been a deal done in installments, which is another suggestion that I've seen. They need to kind of look to do those kind of deals, in my opinion, because this squad doesn't look, it isn't stronger than last season's squad. It's exactly the same as the second half of last season's squad, with 1 or 2 players obviously missing through injury. So, like you said, it would be a massive boost for them to go out and get 2 loan players. Obviously, Hamza Chowdhury is one of the players that's been talked about. I know that that there is some serious interest there, and I know that the player himself is open to that move as well, would be keen on it. But it'll depend on whether Leicester believe that letting him come out to Newcastle is a good move. He needs games, but having said that, they've obviously got they're obviously fighting on a few fronts themselves this season. So is that realistic? I'd say it's less than 50-50, but that doesn't mean that it won't happen. It doesn't mean that they might look elsewhere.
It's interesting that you mention how strong or weak the squad is. Steve Bruce was asked about that in his press conference yesterday. I don't know if you heard the loud music there. That was one of the adverts playing on our website as I went to get the quote. And he said, I'm not sure how it's any weaker. Well, it's probably not, but as you say, it's not any stronger. But then I guess people might say, well, Andy Carroll's gone. He was said to have been brought in to add to the squad. So where's his replacement? Because there doesn't seem, and I don't want to be too negative. I know we're only 2 games into the new season, but there really doesn't seem to be a plan B. We haven't seen a plan B in those first 2 games, and I'm not saying Andy Carroll was the answer by any stretch, but a player up front who's a bit different to Carroll, who's a bit different to Wilson, a bit different to Gale, would be welcome, because someone who's big and strong changes the nature of the game. And I do worry that Newcastle simply haven't got the options off the bench to actually change their game plan, plan A.
Well, I mean, that's one thing that worries me. The other thing is what happens if injuries hit them, because striker wise now they're obviously light on Yoshi Mutu's gone, and Andy Carroll have both gone. Now Mutu was out on loan last season. Carroll didn't play much last season, so you could argue that it's no weaker. But what happens if Callum Wilson gets another injury? He got 2 injuries last season that ruled him out for kind of medium-term injuries, 4 or 5 weeks, both of them. He's not a player who's prone to a lot of injuries, although he has had the 2 serious injuries. But we've got to hope that he goes through the whole season fit. Alan Saint-Maximin is prone to injuries. He's had a few since he's been here. Probably why he's still at Newcastle, to be honest with you, is that there are those concerns over, whether he can play a full season. And the kind of money that Newcastle would have been asking for him meant that they couldn't really, the teams weren't going to come in from. So that's my concern, is where are the other options in the squad? You've got Dwight Gale, but again, he's had his injury problems. So then you're looking at Joelinton, but so far this season, he's been a bit part player. I would like to see him get a chance against Burnley tonight. Obviously, ignore that if they've played the game and he's had a stinker. But I would like to see him get a chance, because I think that's there. The other issue that I have is that there's nothing really coming from the academy. There's nothing really there in terms of under 23s. Other clubs have players that are maybe there and ready to come through. I look at Tottenham giving Dane Scarlett, a 17-year-old, outstanding 17-year-old, a debut last week. Where's that player for Newcastle? Elliot Anderson's one of them, obviously injured at the moment. But where are the other players for Newcastle? They're going to play Sean Longstaff as a number 10. That worries me. That worries me greatly about Newcastle, is that there isn't really that. It doesn't feel like that squad's there. It feels like at the moment this is a squad that's there to maybe get them to kind of mid-table, and that's fine. But where's the inspiration there? Where are fans meant to feel, that they're going to kick forward? We've seen them now, compete. I think in both of the games, although they've lost both of the games, and obviously lost on Saturday in the end in very disappointing manner. First half hour they were on top against West Ham for 50 minutes. I was sitting there thinking, what have I been worried about all summer? This is exactly what we hope Newcastle were going to be this season. They have got capability going forward, but then you've got the final 40 minutes, and then you've got the second half against Aston Villa, and you do worry about where those wins are going to come from. They need to win on Saturday, and it seems weird to say that 3 games in, but they need to show something, I think, for fans. That otherwise, it's going to be. The feeling is going to be that it's going to be a very long season. And you talk about the squad. The reason I think that Steve Bruce is what a lot of fans are looking at and saying they feel like, well, if we're not going to improve the squad, where does the improvement come from? And a lot of fans feel the improvement comes from getting a manager in who is maybe going to look at things differently, because we know what Steve Bruce is capable of. The last 2 seasons have shown what the seasons are going to look like under Steve Bruce, and that is, where we are. Unfortunately, the worry is that if he can't turn it around as he did last season, if he can't turn it around as he did the season before as well, it is going to be massive struggle. So fans are going to look at the dugout and say that that's where we can improve. I think it's probably a little bit too early to write the season off and say they're going to be in a relegation struggle. But fans have had 2 seasons now to make the decision about Steve Bruce, and that's why a lot of them feel that way. And you've got to say 2 games in, if they're going to outstrip what they did last season, they're going to have to start stringing some wins together very, very soon.
I think one of the biggest concerns for me is that we're only 2 games in, and already you can sense the apathy within the fan base. Like, there is no enthusiasm. You've mentioned that, the way Newcastle are approaching it, where's the inspiration? You can totally understand why Newcastle fans, or a large part of them, are just looking at it, and they're not necessarily getting angry at the performances or results. They're just kind of shrugging their shoulders and going, well, this is Mike Ashley's Newcastle United, and that plays into the fact that, we're not going to see any more permanent signings. There might be a couple of loan deals coming if someone can come in and improve Newcastle. And it's just, I can totally understand where some Newcastle United fans are sitting at the moment. I mean, I'm a fan myself, so I'm kind of in that boat a little bit as well. You mentioned there the under-23s, and you mentioned the likes of Elliot Anderson. We know we've got Rodrigo Vilca as another name that stands out. Now, Anderson's injured, but last season he wasn't, and he was in and around the squad. Is it a case that Steve Bruce has got to be a little bit more brave, perhaps, with these players? They might not yet be at the highest level, but I do sometimes think that Newcastle fans might look upon it and give Steve Bruce a little bit more of a break if actually he said, look, we're going to try and get some of these kids into the starting 11. And if it doesn't work straight away, or it doesn't go to plan, at least, we've got youngsters coming through and he's giving them a chance rather than just keeping them on the outskirts. And, we look at Matty Longstaff and he's going to set to go out on loan. They're talking about bringing Chowdhury in, and people are looking at that and thinking, well, is Chowdhury any better than Matty Longstaff? Has Matty Longstaff been given a proper go? I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because I know from my understanding that Vilca could have gone out on loan. There was the option. I think there is still the option that he could potentially go out on loan. But his belief and his feeling is that he can get into that first team squad. He can be around it this season, and we'll probably look at, like you said, the dearth of options that they've got up front and think, well, if there are a few injuries, then I might be in there. Now, I don't think Steve Bruce is sold on the idea of some of the players in the under-23s being ready just yet. I'm not saying he's writing them off forever, but he will turn around and say, well, I'm a manager of a Premier League football club with big expectations to just at least stay in the Premier League, and I need to pick the team that I feel is best for the job. The issue with Steve Bruce and the players that he's picked up front are, he didn't really give Andy Carroll a go last season. Dwight Gale didn't really get an opportunity last season either. It was very much either Callum Wilson, or Joelinton, or potentially, you had Sean Longstaff playing number 10 and various different ways of playing. But he really did stick to players that he knew, and Callum Wilson will play every week, obviously. So he should, because he's the best player in the team, if you ask me. But yeah, I do think that they have to give opportunities. I would like to see, some of those players get opportunities in the FA Cup. We say tonight they're gonna go with a strong team, but it would be great to see one or two of those players involved in it. Matty Longstaff's a different kettle of fish. I think probably last season there were injury problems for him. Nobody kind of really went into it too much with Matty Longstaff. There were injury worries, and I think a bigger problem for Matty Longstaff is he just hasn't found form. I don't think he's really had opportunities, but I also don't think that when he's come in, maybe around Christmas last season he was good, but he hasn't really grasped those chances. So I suppose it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation with young players. We've seen that these predecessors didn't really want to give some young players who've turned out to be really good an opportunity as well. Adam Armstrong didn't get a chance. Adam Armstrong's going to line up against Newcastle on Saturday. A £15 million player probably got more threat than some of the squad players that Newcastle have got in there. So it's always difficult. I would like to see, in particular, Elliot Anderson, I think this year get an opportunity. I think he is outstanding and he could really be very, very good. Vilca, he looks bigger. He's certainly got the right attitude from what I hear. He's got ability, no doubt about that. He's got ability. And it's just whether anybody's going to take that opportunity on him, because you did see, I mentioned Dane Scarlett there, but you saw him play in the Europa Conference League, I think, for Spurs last week, and he was kind of anonymous. That's the problem. I think that Steve Bruce will look at it is that's sometimes what happens with young players. They can be very, very, very good, but they are going to be a bit inconsistent. I think that's probably what's happened with Matty Longstaff. But I think, like you said, it just adds to the narrative that there's nothing really there. There's nothing to kind of hang your hat on at the moment. We had the takeover last season. Everybody kind of obsessed about, because there really wasn't that much exciting things to look at on the field. Now we know that takeover isn't going to happen before the end of the season. Let's be honest. Is it still there? I'm not convinced myself at the moment that it's in particularly good health. But obviously we'll see. But there's no point in talking about it at the moment. There's no point in looking at it. There's no point in thinking about the bright future that could happen with Newcastle United, because it's not there. The reality is what we see in front of us. The narrative will come when things either start getting better or start getting worse, and there's fans in the ground, and that's where we start to see it. I think what's been amazing this season so far is that the number of people in the ground and the number of people at away games probably reflects how much people are willing to get behind a club that that looks forward and does the right things. But at the moment, I'm afraid Newcastle United doesn't really feel like that.
Would you then sanction Matty Longstaff to go out on loan? And obviously Everton have got an interest in Sean Longstaff. What would you do with the elder brother?
Well, I think, if you get an offer for Sean Longstaff, and then you can replace him with somebody else, I'm not saying that I would, I think that probably both of the brothers at the moment are underrated at Newcastle United. I think that Sean, actually start to see it. It always happens with academy players that they're, even outstanding ones like Sean, they do end up, I think, sometimes getting undervalued at the clubs that they're at. He's had a tough year. The first season after his breakout year, he had bad injuries. Last season, I think, was a difficult year for everybody. But he was playing in a midfield that I don't think really, too many games bypassed him. So does he need a fresh start? Well, potentially, yeah. But I think what I would have liked to have seen was a Sean Longstaff that was, that was kind of made a very important member of the team. But I think, to be fair to Steve Bruce, it was a very bad injury that he got in that West Ham game 2 years ago. And I think probably it's knocked him back. It's knocked his progression back 6 to 12 months. That's what we're seeing now. So does he need a fresh start? If they can bring somebody in who's, maybe is going to improve them, then potentially, yeah. But I think it'd be a crying shame if he left. I think it'd be a crying shame if Matty Longstaff left and didn't come back and fulfill his potential. We've seen glimpses of what both of these lads can do, and they're really, really good players. They're local, and they do have, massive ability. It doesn't feel like that at the moment because probably they're in the same boat that a lot of Newcastle's players are in, which is where they're probably just not quite at the level that they need to be at yet. So I suppose my honest opinion on that one is sometimes you need a change. It would depend, and I'm not privy to his exact mindset, but it would depend on how much the player himself wants to stay at the football club. If he's desperate to stay, I know that the club were quite keen for him to stay as well. But if, they obviously feel that when he's changed agents, he's obviously got his contract situation is hanging over him. It was hung over Matty Longstaff for a long time as well. I think that needs to be resolved. And if the resolution is that, look, they've got an agent who's looking for other opportunities and thinks he can move them forward, perhaps it is best for all parties that he moves on. But I would like to see both of them stay and play their best football for Newcastle United.
Just on the loan market, I mean, if you're going to go out and get a couple of players in that are going to improve your squad, it's likely you're going to have to pay some sort of fee. We've seen reports today that the Manchester United who ended up at Villa, there was a fee there, and reportedly Newcastle didn't want to or couldn't pay the fee. What's your kind of take on that? Because it's a valid question over who's going to come in on loan. That's you're not going to require £2, £3, £4 million loan fee.
Well, I mean, there is, it's pretty standard. It's pretty standard now that you do have to pay a loan fee. I suppose it depends. Again, we said the budget with Newcastle United is not so much that they don't have money. It's that you have to make a case, and then Mike Ashley has to green light that case. So basically, with Joe Willock, if it was Salomon Rondon and it was £15 million that they were asking for, it wouldn't have got done this summer. So they didn't have 20. It wasn't like he had a budget of 25 million and he had to go and decide who he wanted. And he could have gone out and signed Salomon Rondon for however, well, he's obviously a free agent. He could have gone out and signed a 30-year-old striker for 10 million, and then I could have got somebody else who's 31 for 10 million and could have spent £5 million. It just doesn't work that way at Newcastle United. what has to happen is they have to make an individual case for a player. It goes through the various levels of management, and then it goes to Mike Ashley. And Joe Willock, I think they probably looked at and thought, he's not only outstanding in terms of what he can do for the club, it also sends a message. The other thing is, he's an asset. And I would think probably, I'm not 100% sure on this, but I would think that with Joe Willock, there are clauses in his contract. Probably there is a fee at which he can move away from Newcastle United, which I wouldn't have thought would be, an absolutely huge prohibitive fee. It would probably be a fee where Newcastle probably look at it and think, well, we could go and buy somebody else and recycle the money, which I think is probably what Mike Ashley's going to stay in charge for a while, is where they're going to have to go. They're going to have to start doing that again, because he's not going to put capital outlay in. So that means that they have to start getting players. So it does probably mean that Alan Saint-Maximin at some point, they can get the 70, 80 million pounds that they're looking for him. You sell him, you reinvest the money in outstanding players. That's what the model used to be. The model hasn't been that for a long time. So I look at Newcastle and sort of say, potentially, was the reason for the Tuanzebe loan fee not being accepted because they looked at that and thought, well, actually, he's not necessarily worth the loan fee that they're asking for? Or was it a situation where they looked at it and said, Hamza Chowdhury, well, that might be more worth our while, make a case. That's the problem with Newcastle. It's very much the power lines aren't certain. We're not entirely certain on, who's making the decisions. It usually comes down to Mike Ashley. So I would think that probably, if they lose another game, it might be that they look at it and say, well, look, we need to get something in. We need to inject a bit of positivity into it. Where can we go from here? That's the problem at Newcastle. That's the way that they work. I wrote this piece yesterday where I said they probably need some more football knowledge in the executive structure at Newcastle. A director of football or a sporting director would be perfect at Newcastle, in my opinion. But obviously, they're not looking at it at the moment. So I wouldn't rule out the fact that they might go and spend a loan fee that's bigger than the one that obviously, reportedly has been, they've not paid for Tuanzebe, sorry. But I think at the moment, it's, as I said, it's 50-50 whether they sign anybody before the deadline. They need somebody though.
Let's look on the pitch. Lots of questions, Mark, over selection, over formation. I mean, the 5 at the back or the 3 centre backs or the 2 wing backs is creating a lot of debate across social media and obviously within the press as well. Does that system work, do you think? Because I think Albert, I don't know if you, Mark, have you listened to the BBC Newcastle phone-in with Steve Bruce? The chap Albert, who's a regular caller on there, made the excellent point that, in his opinion, and I actually agree with him, Richie and Murphy are now beginning to get targeted by the opposition because they're not defenders. They have performed well, and I was one of those who praised Richie's return and praised Murphy in that role for adapting, and they deserved that. But you do look at them in the first 2 games, and their defensive frailties are beginning to show, and it's a worry going forward. I'm just wondering, do you think Steve Bruce sticks with that formation but changes the personnel, or does he change the formation? I suppose you would have to change the personnel if he changes the formation.
Yeah, I think what they had for the first 2 games in particular was, a situation where they've probably got the players to play that formation, and I think that is why he's gone for that. That's why he's gone for that way. He wants to get a team out that attack, and you've seen that formation probably does help them going forward. They are probably a bit more fluid. You saw that at the end of last season. That's the reason why. He knows that Murphy and Richie, probably when they're on the front foot, are good. And we say that they haven't been brilliant in those first 2 games, but the first 40 minutes against West Ham on the opening day of the season, formation worked really well. The system worked well. They were causing problems. West Ham scored against the run of play, in my opinion, and I felt that Newcastle looked as if they had a good system there. The problem came in the second half when West Ham, who have got capability going forward, definitely, no doubt about that, stepped the gas up and put it on Newcastle. And I think that was always the problem. It's always been the problem for Newcastle. It's been the problem for Bruce. It was the problem for Benitez. His analogy was the short blanket. Bruce, obviously hasn't talked about short blanket. It's the same thing. He's always said back last season, when he started going on about I've got to take, the gloves are coming off and I'm going to play the way that I want to play and all that, because he felt that if they played attacking football, they would concede more goals. They would look more more vulnerable at the back. And I think it's the age-old problem for Newcastle. When Paul Dummett comes back, does that then give them a different option? Paul Dummett, I think probably he could play on the left of a back three, or he could play at left back. They could go back to a sort of four at the back, maybe a 4-4-1-1 or a 4-5-1-1. Anything that they can, any different ways that they can play depends on the personnel that they've got. Unfortunately, at the moment, it is being exposed for its frailties. It should, in theory, on Saturday, be the perfect time to play that formation, because they should be going for Southampton. They've got the attacking players that actually do that, and they should be going for it. And that would be what I would hope. But yeah, they're going to have to change the formation, because they've conceded 6 goals in 2 games, scored 2 in the first game. But again, if they're not scoring, then they are conceding too many goals. And I think away from home in particular, that's going to be an issue. Their next game when they come back after the international break is Manchester United. Now we know that they can really hurt teams, so it would not surprise me if they probably give it another go on Saturday. They might go with it tonight, where I know you're going to talk a bit about tonight. I'm a veteran of too many of these midweek League Cup games for Newcastle in August, and they're always disjointed. They're always difficult to watch. Sometimes they get knocked out. I think they'll win tonight, and I think they'll get through. And a little bit of me thinks they might draw Sunderland in the next round, but don't know why I think that. I just do. But again, fast forward this bit if you're listening after that. But I do think that they've probably got to give it another couple of games before they maybe go to something a bit more solid when they're playing some of the bigger teams.
I've got a question here from Roger Cook, and we kind of discussed this earlier in the show, but he thinks, Mark, do you think we'll see during this season Steve Bruce's failure to change, i.e. having no plan B? And I guess we look at the subs that are made during the first 2 games. I mean, they've kind of been like for like, and then the formation has switched, but it's looked a bit desperate at times. I think against Villa, people were saying there was a look of confusion on people's faces because they didn't really know what the instruction was. There was at one point there seemed to be 4 up front, and it's things like that where it's difficult, I suppose, to get the balance, because we're saying he hasn't got a plan B, but then he has changed it. But to many people, it's looking a bit desperate. So it's about getting that fine balance, I guess.
Yeah, and look, most people have decided that Steve Bruce tactically isn't of the level that they want as Newcastle United manager. So I think probably you fit the narrative onto that point. And they got beaten by Aston Villa because they just were beaten by a better team, a better drilled team, a team that looked to have a bit more about it. The depressing thing for me is that Villa are 2 years up in the Premier League now, so this is their 3rd season in the Premier League. Newcastle are 5, is it this year? And have been overtaken by Villa. They've been overtaken by a lot of other clubs as well, but they've been overtaken by Villa. Some of that, I think, is down to investment, which Newcastle haven't had, although they have. Newcastle have probably invested a little bit of money in the last couple of years in terms of Willock and Callum Wilson, when other teams maybe weren't. But there is the big question about the manager. And I think we saw it on Monday. I think I watched the Monday Night Football with Neville and Carragher, where they talked about the top 4. They were trying to be very politely basically say that the reason that Manchester United weren't going to challenge for the title this season was because the manager. And the reason maybe Newcastle United aren't going to challenge to be in the top 10 this season potentially is the manager. And that, for me, is where I think he's going to be the story for the next few weeks. And I think that, for me, he's got to make the right decisions. They've got to start putting some wins together. If they'd have won that first game of the season, it becomes a very, very different story. The narrative is totally different. They had a great end to the season where Bruce did by himself, I think, some credit and time, because they really were good at the end of last season. And, a lot of the changes that he made, a lot of the ways that he tried to motivate the team worked, but he's not going to get that amount of time this season if they go into the next run of fixtures having not got any points. You don't, in the Premier League, you just don't get that amount of time. And like you said, it looks a mess when they change things as they did on Saturday, and it doesn't get the result. He has done it in the past and it has worked. He's an intuitive manager. That's the problem with Bruce in some ways, and the benefit, I think, sometimes of Bruce. He's intuitive. you have Benitez, who I think it was chalk and cheese really between him and Benitez. Benitez comes in. He had a very, very bad start his final season where they hadn't won going into October, almost going into November, they hadn't won a game. And it started to feel very, very claustrophobic at St James's Park. But he said, I know what I'm doing. I am going to stick with what I know. And the results eventually did turn. With Bruce, I think probably what will happen if they keep losing games, he isn't going to take that impression. He's going to change things. He's going to, like he did last season, he's going to say, I am going to change things. I'm going to make sure I change things. I don't let the grass grow under me. And the worry with that, I think if you're a manager, is sometimes it looks like you're kind of grasping around for solutions. Obviously, at the back end of last season, he made those changes and they worked. So that's what we've got to hope happens this season. But again, it feels like we're not talking about a big change. We're talking about a manager trying to keep Newcastle United in the Premier League until things move forward. And I understand that. Look, if there's not going to be a takeover, Newcastle fans will say, "Well, can we go and get a Graham Potter or somebody like that who's going to?" Okay, it's a gamble, but it will be a new sort of way of looking at Newcastle. I don't think that while they're in this sort of limbo that they're in at the moment, the purgatory they've got at the moment, that too much is going to change, and we'll just be looking at hopefully picking up some wins and picking up some runs. And look, we know that the end of last season it was fun to watch, so it's not all doom and gloom, in my opinion, because it was fun to watch at the end of last season. They did get to the quarterfinals of the League Cup. Admittedly, it was the sketchiest run to the League Cup League Cup quarterfinals that I've ever known. But they could get there and they could go and kick on. It just needs one win, and you hope that this is a big week, and you hope that the 2 wins come this week and it calms everything down before international break, because it's going to feel very claustrophobic, I think, at Newcastle again if they lose these 2, and then they've got Manchester United coming up after the international break.
Just a quick word on Steve Buscemi. We mentioned how he was on the BBC radio Newcastle talking. I tweeted that I thought he came across quite well. I got a bit of stick for that, but I thought he did all right. I thought there was some decent enough questions that came through, about how he appears to talk down Newcastle and talk up the opposition. I thought it was a great question. I think he answered that. And, okay, some of the questions weren't as tough as people maybe had liked, but I thought overall he came across, well enough. How do you think he started the season in terms of, in terms of that was important, but also after games, I know VAR's grabbed the headlines in the first 2 games, but that's what he's focused on. Do you kind of agree with that approach? I mean, can we blame VAR for the opening 2 defeats, or is Steve's got to be a bit more honest and open about, okay, we just didn't turn up today. We just, we weren't good enough in the second halves of these games.
Well, yeah, I mean, to be fair to him, he has said that in the past when he's felt that Newcastle have been really poor or atrocious. I mean, he said that last season during that horrendous run. A few times he went in really hard. He admitted that things weren't good enough, and he took himself. So I don't think he's, totally, like deluded in that way. I don't think that, I think, to be fair, absolutely fair to him, he has said that in the past. VAR, I think, I look at some. I think what happens is when you've got a manager who's up against it a little bit, we do really well. Fans, I think, do maybe not in the media quite as much. Fans really do zero in on what he says, and can't say anything right really in those situations. But when you look at all managers, I look at I kind of see a lot of the press conferences and things, especially the post-match stuff. You don't get a lot of deep analysis in those press conferences. What you tend to get is very annoyed, angry managers talking about 1 or 2 things that they feel that maybe haven't gone their way. So it doesn't surprise me that he went to VAR, and I think they have had a difficult situation when it comes to VAR. But I think the worry is with something like Aston Villa is that it's early in the season, second half it didn't play well. And I think that what you end up having is a real disconnect between what the fans feel and what, as a reporter, you're watching, and maybe what the manager says, which is he can't. He is going to concentrate on the positives, I think, probably a bit more, and he's going to blame. If there's a scapegoat out there, he's going to do that. So I kind of don't read too much into what he says post match. I think pre-match, I think there was a tendency to talk Newcastle down, but probably that comes from where the club is at the moment, and we don't like to hear it, but I think even Benitez, although he spoke really well about how ambitious the club should be, he talked the club down as well to an extent because of where they are. He said it'd be a miracle if we stayed in the Premier League. So, and he didn't get as much stick for that as possibly something like Steve Bruce would have done. I thought the BBC Newcastle interview was exactly what he kind of needs to do. It's very difficult. It's like I kind of always said, I've always advocated. I think we spoke about it last season as well, for people's press conferences, basically to say, look, okay, we as journalists ask the questions that we feel the most important. We ask the ones that we see on Twitter. We see how fans react. I mean, look, it's been very different since the pandemic, by the way, because everything's conducted over Zoom. Newcastle still, Newcastle still sort of because of the COVID restrictions and the way things are changing, still sort of. A lot of journalists aren't, not every journalist is getting into a press conference. Not every journalist is getting into games at the moment. So, you've got to be aware that that's the situation. Pandemic has changed the game a lot. So Bruce isn't getting questioned in the same way that he is. Now, my people's press conference idea is basically to say, right, you get Bruce on a Zoom, you say 45 minutes, you sort of ask, you get people on to ask the questions. And I think it would be really compelling, and I know that's what basically BBC Newcastle did a little bit.
Are you talking a bit like the COVID-19 press conferences that the PM does?
Yeah, a little bit. I just think it would work because I think at the moment you've got a guy in Steve Bruce who he's not aloof. He's not aloof. For all the people have a go at him, you have people at the football club who don't talk, who won't answer questions, who won't address the pressing issues on the record. They will do it off the record. They've done it before at fans forums off the record. They won't do it on the record. Steve Bruce answers any question that's thrown at him, pretty much. Obviously not everyone, pretty much everyone. I think it benefits him to front up those questions and answer them and get some of his critics on to do it. It's always been my opinion that would be a good way of doing things. Unfortunately, the way that professional football works, we see it at other clubs where they actually try to restrict access. They don't want people having as much access to their manager as possible. And I've never for the life of me understood why, because the people involved in football are quite capable of talking well. Steve Bruce, if, there was a lot made of, I think last season, Steve Bruce sometimes would bite back at journalists, or he wasn't happy with the coverage, sometimes in the Chronicle, sometimes in other outlets as well. But that's fine. That, for me, that is acceptable. We criticised him. Why would he like that? Why would he not think that it's another way of, he would want to speak in another way, or answer back some of the critics that he had. So he did answer the questions that then, Lee Ryder and Kieran Kelly put for him. And for me, that's healthy in a lot of ways. Look, he might not like the way that we write about it all the time, but the more communication that you can get out from him to fans directly and through us, the better, in my opinion. So really well done, I think, for doing the BBC Newcastle thing. You can argue till the cows come home about how well he came across. He's not going to say the things that you want him to say. That's top and bottom of it. But I have a lot of respect for somebody answering questions that directly put to them. And it's easy for on Twitter for you to say, well, they didn't ask the question that I want, but did you go and try and get in on there? I saw a few fans actually who are quite critical of him on Twitter who did get on and asked him some really, really good questions. So, if the forum's there, the club should facilitate something, in my opinion, but it's very unlikely that they will do that. And, I always thought fans forums should be broadcast live on Facebook, personally. Why not? What is the point in Lee Charnley going into a fans forum and answering questions off the record to a select group of fans? No point at all. And saying that some of those things you're not allowed to say. There's no point to that at all. Absolutely no point to it. It makes no sense. You've got 4 or 5 people in fans forum who may get the answers. But what's the point? Unless you're going to publicly communicate, it's really pointless. And I think Steve Bruce, to be fair to him, probably not the most sophisticated in the way that, the modern media and the way that Twitter and social media work. Probably not, probably finds that difficult in some ways. But it's very honest, heart on the sleeve kind of guy. And, that's how he is.
just finally, then we'll have a quick word about Burnley tonight. For you guys listening later on the podcast, if Newcastle have already played, hopefully they're through to the next round. I'm going to sit in the Gallagher. I'm taking the better half, so I'm hoping it's an entertaining game. The last game I was at was actually Burnley just before lockdown. So yeah, that was one of the wasn't a good game to say goodbye to St James's Park to. I'm hoping tonight we do see a bit of a better game. I'm hoping Steve Bruce plays his strongest side available to him. I know I wrote yesterday that Newcastle have a chance to build momentum tonight. We know Sean Dyche is going to play what looks like a very weakened Burnley side. We had Dwight McNeil saying the big game is Saturday against Leeds, so we know where their head lies on that. And I just think tonight, with the start of the season Newcastle have had, there's a massive chance to build momentum going into a massive game against Southampton on Saturday. And, I would risk playing Wilson and St Maximin for the first half, for the first hour, and try and get the job done early, because then you've won. And the feeling going into Saturday is going to be brilliant. It's going to be bouncing, traditional 3:00 kickoff. If they lose, then it's a massive game on Saturday, and it really should be unthinkable that Newcastle United go out tonight, because if they do, Saturday will just be an absolute nightmare for Steve Bruce. It'll be nervy, it'll be tetchy before the game, and that never feeds in well to the actual atmosphere in the ground during the game, does it?
No, and I think that would be my concern if they lose tonight. I don't think, if Burnley are going to play a weakened team, Newcastle are going to go strong. I think Steve Bruce has been good in the cups in terms of his team selections. I think he's stayed true to what he always said he would do, which is play the strongest teams available to him with a few changes. You've got to rotate the squad. Jeff Hendricks plays, isn't he? And a few others. I think probably you'll see Joelinton playing instead of Callum Wilson. I think probably Alan Saint-Maximin might play as well. Joe Willock will get minutes. But there's enough there to win the game. And I think they probably will win the match. But yeah, it's absolutely vital for them to win tonight and kick on. It'll be interesting to see whether he plays Freddie Woodman as well, or whether he goes with Gillespie in goal. Obviously, that's a question mark for them. Whether they, the goalkeeping situation's been, how unlucky and how cursed can you be as Newcastle United to have four, capable Premier League goalkeepers and two of them injured. One of them, obviously with a really nasty bout of COVID, and one of them, looks like he's not going to be back until the end of October now, and he is very, very important to Newcastle United, Martin Dubravka. So, I think they'll win the game tonight. I think they'll get through, and depending on who they draw in the next round, there's a huge opportunity for them there. As I said, there's Sunderland are in the draw, a few other clubs in the draw as well. I think most of the teams got through last night. There wasn't too many shocks last night, but obviously the big clubs come in the next round as well. You've got your Manchester United, Manchester City, you've won it 3 years running, haven't I think? Liverpool and other clubs like that coming in as well. So it's vital that they're in that next round. Absolutely vital. And I think they will do it tonight. I think, I think it's always the situation with Newcastle. They'd have won the opening game and got something out of Villa, which I think they could have done both of those things. We'd now be talking about, well, what was the fuss about? Whereas, they're probably not that strong, but they're not as, in my opinion, I don't think they're 0 points out of 6 for their efforts in the first two games. I think probably they've been undermined by stupid mistakes, bad VAR call in the West Ham game, and terrible defending. Just they lost their minds, I think, in that sort of brief period. But they should have got something out of the West Ham game. Could have got something out of Villa. They're not as bad as a 0 out of two games team, but they've got to go and show it now. And I think they can do that tonight and hopefully take something out of Saturday as well.
Yeah, fingers crossed Newcastle do get through to the next round of the EFL Cup. Thanks, Mark, for popping on to Everything is Black and White podcast. You guys watching and listening, please head over to chroniclelive.co.uk to keep up to date with all the latest Newcastle United news.